this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
In 1940, for 113 harrowing days, Nazi Germany's Luftwaffe unleashed relentless attacks on Great Britain, aiming to secure an early victory in World War II. The defence of southern England fell to the brave pilots of the Royal Air Force, joined in their hour of need by over 100 Canadian airmen. These men hailed from all walks of life, some from prominent families, others fresh off the farm. They served with distinction in 47 different Battle of Britain squadrons. I'm Angus Wallace, and in this episode I'm joined by Ted Barris, author of Battle of Britain, Canadian Airmen in Their Finest Hour, to explore their incredible contributions during this pivotal chapter of the war. Ted, thanks for joining me. Before we get to those crucial months in the summer of 1940, I'm curious about aviation in Canada in those interwar years. I tend to think due to its size, there must have been plenty of opportunity for prospective pilots in Canada during the interwar years. I think isn't there even a big old book set in Canada?
Well, you put your finger, Angus, on an important aspect of Canada, which the phenomenon of aviation addresses, and that is its size. We need the ability to move quickly and over long distances. I mean, if you look at the canon of books on bush flying into northern Canada, I mean, those pilots were extraordinary because when you go north of the tree line in any part of Canada, you're essentially dependent on your abilities as a pilot to get home because there's nothing, I mean nothing, in terms of registration of detail on the ground. You have to know exactly what you're doing. But that's really not why the country was awash with pilots between the wars. I think Canadians became that because we got wrapped up in the romance and the excitement of flight, much as everyone else did, presumably if you were 20 years old in the 19 teens and 20s, a little younger then and older in the 30s. And I say that because there were circumstances at play leading up to the Battle of Britain that really made the movement of Canadian pilots to Britain a slam dunk. And by that I mean, after the First War, the war to end all wars, Canada made a very specific decision at high level in government to eliminate air training, aircraft production, the expansion of fighter squadrons and bomber squadrons in Canada because there would be no need for aviation. In fact, one of the ministers of without portfolio in the Robert Borden government between the First and Second Wars said aviation is a war thing. There's no need for aviation in peacetime. And so ironically, in Canada, we scaled back training and the investment of money and budgets in military aircraft. And so we were really bereft of the machinery. In contrast to that, or two contrasts, one in Britain, it was just the opposite, because in the RAF, there was the very quick recognition in the late 20s and early 30s, war was coming again, we better ramp up and be prepared. In Canada, there was something called the Air Board, created in 1919, and it addressed what was this phenomenon of this romance of flight and that the interest in civilian lives to fly. Charles Lindbergh, Amelia Earhart, those images, that the romanticism of those flights caught everybody, captured our imagination. And so when the Air Board made money available for little one hangar, one gypsy moth kind of airfield operations all across the country to pop up, people were spending whatever discretionary income they had to get flying lessons. And so you had all these young men and women, but mostly men, going off and learning on the weekend to fly. And so we had all these little operations where flight was the popular hobby that everybody invested in. And there was lots of sky to fly in, and there were these small operations to take your money to do that. And the government was, in contrast to not spending militarily, was helping civilian aviation get off the ground. Now, when suddenly in the 1930s, the RAF offers what was called the direct entry scheme, which was a plan by the RAF to say, Commonwealth airmen if you have a private pilot's license and you can get to Britain, we'll see if you're capable of flying military aircraft. And if you're capable of that, we will give you what's called in the RAF a short service commission. Meaning, okay, I'm sitting in the middle of Canada in Saskatchewan, say, and I'm 20 and I don't have a job. I don't have 3 square meals of the day, but I got a private pilot's license. Would I not jump on the fastest, quickest available cattle boat to get me to Britain to get a chance to become an officer in the RAF? You bet I would. And 118 Canadians through the 1930s jumped on those cattle boats, got to Britain, passed the tests and the medicals, and got to be in the RAF short service commissioned officers. And suddenly they'd arrive. Well, of course, in return for that commission, they had to give the Air Force, the RAF, 6 years service. Do the math. If I arrive in Britain in 1935, get my short service commission, and I'm able to fly the fastest, the best, the most lethal aircraft, the Hurricanes and the Spitfires by 1939, 1940, suddenly I'm a Canadian in the front lines of the Battle of Britain.
It is remarkable. I wonder if the RAF was seeing it as a cost saving that they don't have to train their own pilots. We could get them already partly trained.
Well, it was a direct entry and add in their quick entry scheme for the RAF to get qualified pilots. And because Canada threw at pilots every conceivable environmental problem that flying in Canada might provide, I mean, icing in the wings, thunderstorms that came out of nowhere, ground that looked in Saskatchewan the same as it looked in Manitoba, suddenly the ability of the young men who were getting those private pilot's licenses was much higher level. These men were much more skilled than might be the case in any other parts of the Commonwealth, and maybe even in Britain.
Once they're in the RAF, are they just treated as regular RAF pilots? They're not put into separate units pre-war? They're just flying regular military duties?
Well, actually, a combination of both. Because coincidentally, remember a moment ago I talked about how we had scaled back our military aviation plan. When the war finally is looming and our Prime Minister then, Mackenzie King, recognizes that Canada's got to step up and help Mother England, he doesn't like the notion of remembering back to the First World War when we had horrendous casualties. We had conscription and huge budgets that we took years to equalize. King gets a note from Vincent Massey, who's our High Commissioner in London at the time, later the famous Governor General in Canada. Vincent Massey tells King, one of the ways we could serve RAF and British needs in the early days of the war is to train aircrew the same way we did during the First World War. And the birth of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, which was Mackenzie King's pride and joy, meant that he could keep control of things back here in Canada. All of those involved would be volunteers. There wouldn't be as many casualties. The budgets were controlled. But the RAF, facing the problem of the looming Battle of Britain, and even before that, the Battle of France, says, excuse me, Mr. Prime Minister in Canada, we want Canadians in our Air Force. Will you send a squadron? And King says, no. We're spending $1.75 billion on the training of aircrew from all over the Commonwealth. We haven't got any more money to send you a bona fide, complete, self-sufficient squadron. Ultimately, we do, but not at that early days of the war. And so the RAF says, well, we happen to know there are about 118 Canadians who have come by various means into the RAF through the direct entry scheme. We will create a squadron. They take an orphan squadron, 242, and they throw all these Canadians in it, and it instantly becomes a Canadian squadron in the RAF. And they fight in France, and they're blooded there. They lose 7 pilots, and they, like everybody else in the withdrawal from France in the last days of the Battle of France, are essentially left with flying with literally the clothes on their backs, very little equipment. They're burning as they leave all these bases in France to get back to Britain, and they are essentially sent back to their station and are forgotten about because they have no equipment. Nobody in the RAF is interested in dealing with them, and they're almost lost to history. And then suddenly they're delivered a fateful card. Guess who gets posted to RAF 242 of all people but Douglas Bader? And Bader, of course, is the intersection of one of the greatest stories of the Second World War and the Canadians. And he begins to lead this ragtag, pretty pissed off bunch of Canadians who've been essentially left for lost. And he whips them into this great squadron, which becomes the core of his big wing concept.
Well, I was slightly intrigued by Bader because they bring, the no-legged pilot Bader. And I do sort of wonder, because this time he wasn't really proven when they first give him the squadron. And he's extremely difficult to get on with. And I thought, I wonder if they've sort of tossed him a bone by giving him a squadron. And then I thought, well, actually, at the same time, I wonder how the Canadians felt about, okay, we're a Canadian. Why do we have to have an English officer? We've all been in the RAF for quite a long time. Why have we got an English officer who's only recently a squadron leader? Can't we be allowed to run ourselves? How does that relation go? Because he is very difficult, is Barda.
He's difficult in both directions. He's difficult as a commander down to his squadron, and he's difficult for the brass above him because he's a real burr in their saddle. He essentially demands, once he's there and recognizes that the Canadians have been essentially left for lost, that they don't have equipment, they don't have tools. In fact, he sends them out to a tailor in Cultishall to get clothes and shoes, to get their respect back. I mean, he realizes after he shows off over the station with all the aerobatics he does in those 30 minutes demonstrating the Canadians on the first day he sees them that he can fly. This legless guy can actually fly a Hurricane. But then he recognizes, he apologizes to them and says, look, you guys have had a tough row. I'm going to whip you into a squadron in my own shape and size and mentality. And he does. And so there's this mutual respect that grows between them. And it's even enhanced all the more when he says essentially to Hugh Dowding, who's Chief Marshal of Fighter Command, we need aircraft, we need supplies, we need tools, and we need backup. And this squadron is not operational until that happens. Now, nobody'd ever done that. Nobody. But when Badr asks for it or demands it, the whole Air Force recognizes that you better answer. And so the Canadians are really caught in that wonderful wake of his life, his reputation, his difficult personality. I mean, he wasn't the easiest guy to serve either for the Canadians, but that mutual need, both for Badr for success and for the Canadians to be back into the fight, creates an incredible story in the middle of the Battle of Britain.
Yeah, it's a tremendous force of will, I think, Badr is just sheer force of will pushed him through and obstinance, which is ultimately why he's still flying after losing his legs in a flying accident. His refusal to accept no as an answer, and that probably shapes much of his career.
And what's wonderful there too, Angus, and I go to great pains to show this, and it reflects on something we talked about a moment ago, why was Canada awash with all these pilots, and who were they and what were their qualifications? The magic of these young men coming in that back door that they did brings to bear some incredible flying skills. One of the stories I tell in my book is about a guy named Kirkpatrick Sklanders. And he was one of three guys who came from a small corner, a little subdivision of the city of St. John in New Brunswick in eastern Canada, a little place called Milledgeville. These three guys were known as the Milledgeville Trio. They were all trained by the same flying instructor in St. John. And Kirkpatrick was so young when he gets his pilot's license, I believe at the time, at 15, he was the youngest man in Canada to get a private pilot's license ever. And he participates in all those barnstorming phenomena during the interwar period. One of the things I didn't mention a moment ago is after all these young guys get their flying licenses and they're doing passenger flying and mail flying and leaflet dropping and bush flying, suddenly they become part of the barnstorming phenomenon. And in those years in Canada, because of our vast distances, there were air shows that would go hippity-hop, hippity-crop across the country, land and show off. And when they landed in St. John, the audiences, the spectators, are allowed to go up and see the gypsy moths and touch the aircraft and meet some of the pilots. And then they're told to go off to the side of the airstrip and watch the show. Well, they're all behind a rope on this occasion in 1931. And suddenly there's this kid in a Boy Scout outfit, and he hops over the rope, and he's walking along in front of all the adults, and they're tisking him to tell him to get back on the right side of the rope, and he ignores them, and he leaves the rope, and he walks out there, and now the adults are shouting at him, "Get back here! You don't belong out there!" And he goes up to the gypsy moth, and he runs his hand along the fuselage and along the wing. He hops up onto the wing, into the cockpit, fires it up, and goes roaring down the runway and takes this gypsy moth into the air and does 10 minutes of aerobatics over the spectators. He was part of the show. And of course, it was Kirkpatrick Sklanders, this 15-year-old kid who is an aviation genius and great showman, in the middle 1930s. And who better to enlist in 242 Squadron ultimately than Patrick Sklanders as one of Bodder's extraordinary group of Canadians.
Hadn't he at one point tried to join the Finns as well as a bit of a checkered career in the Norwegians? He just wanted to fly.
And you've hit on a really important point. These guys wanted to fly and to fight, especially when they recognized what the chance they had was to fly the Spitfires and the Hurricanes, which were miraculous aircraft. That they were leading edge, would be a current way of looking at it. But he has a setback. He gets to Britain through the direct entry scheme, but then he suffers a health issue, goes back to Canada, recovers, wants to get into the war. This is all pre-Battle of France, tries to get in with the Finns against the Russians, tries to get to the Royal Norwegian Air Force against the Luftwaffe, fails in both attempts, and eventually ends up in the French Foreign Legion. And he, like everybody else in France, is fleeing for his life in the spring of 1940. He gets plunked into 242 ultimately because he's so skilled and capable and eager. They're all there wanting to fight. There was this appetite not only for flying, but for fighting. In many ways, that goes back to the great tradition of the First World War, the Royal Flying Corps, with all the Canadians who were involved in the Flying Corps and who became legendary in the Great War. And it's alluded to in a lot of the compliments that the Canadians get, even at 242, is you're maintaining the incredible legacy of, Barker and Bishop and so on of the First War.
Some people's entry to the war and their lives they've had before they got there is just remarkable.
And then, if I may, another aspect of the strange entry of Canadians into the Battle of Britain, even though Mackenzie King had quite seriously chopped back on military spending in the aviation in the pre-Second World War years, many of the men who stayed on and survived the cuts, the big budget cutbacks and diminishing of Air Force personnel and so on, those guys became part of auxiliary squadrons across Canada during the 1930s. Just before the Battle of Britain begins in late 39, early 40, they coalesce as number 1 Royal Canadian Air Force Fighter Squadron, and King and the government send them to Britain on the same ship that Hurricanes are being sent to Britain, which have been constructed in Canada, and they all arrive on June the 21st, 1940, 3 weeks before the Battle of Britain. So number 1 RCAF Fighter Squadron and all those guys in 242 and all the others scattered across the RAF, all these Canadians are suddenly right there, front row, ready to take on the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain when it begins in July.
Folks, we're going to take a short break. We'll be back in a moment. Now, possibly one of the best-known Canadians at this period is Lord Beaverbrook, the newspaper publisher. Under Churchill, he becomes Minister of Aircraft Production, but his son was an airman, which I hadn't realised. Is he with the RAF or the Canadian Air Force?
He was with the RAF. He was, I can't remember the squadron. What's remarkable, I think, about that moment is that these guys suddenly have all of the tools. And I mention again the skill they bring with them from Canada. One of the guys who was in the RCAF number 1 fighter squadron arrives in June, just before the Battle of Britain, is a guy named Ernie McNab. And he had survived all the cuts I alluded to earlier. He was a kid from Saskatchewan, out in the middle of Canada. His dad ran an elevator, the big grain elevators, in a little place called Rostern. And I worked in Saskatchewan for many years, and I was very aware of the skyscraping grain elevators. Anyway, in the 20s, he goes off to Sunday school, and his family, being McNabs, have him wear a kilt to Sunday school. And of course, he takes a lot of kidding and ribbing at Sunday school. Well, Ernie came from a family that didn't tolerate that sort of thing, and he lays out the guy who was criticizing him with one punch. And that kind of mentality was Ernie. Ernie was one of those guys who was going to, come hell or high water, I'm going to do what I have chosen to do. And ultimately, he becomes squadron leader of RCAF number 1 Fighter Squadron. But along the way, again, alluding to the skill these guys bring to the picnic in 1940, along the way, he's recruited by the RCAF to be the leader of an aerobatics squad within the RCAF. And just sort of one of the spin-offs of the Trans-Canada Air Pageant I talked about with all the barnstorming in the 1930s, just before the war breaks out, the Canadian National Exhibition in Toronto has an aerobatics show featuring the American air crew coming up from the States. I can't remember, was it Curtis Hawks they were flying? I believe so. And so having invited the Americans to this big show over Toronto and Lake Ontario in late 1930s, they suddenly think, oh, gee, we better invite our own guys, the RCAF, the Canadian guys. And Ernie is leading a group of 3 airmen. They're flying Siskin biplanes. Ernie decides, and the 2 buddies with him, they better come up with something pretty spectacular for the show over Lake Ontario vis-a-vis the Americans. They go to Borden, which is an air base north of Toronto, and they start practicing with the Siskins, and they take them up to about, I don't know, maybe 7,000 or 8,000 feet, which would be the limit of their climb. And in formation, 3 abreast, and maybe, I don't know, ultimately maybe 100 feet apart in total, they throw the 3 Siskins into death-defying spins to Earth, right? So now you're in unison. You've got 3 Siskins spinning out of control, passing through the thousands of feet in seconds, and they reform, come out of the spins, the death-defying spins, in formation. Well, the crowds across the country loved this stuff, and they did it from literally Halifax to Victoria in the summer of, I don't know, 1937 or 1938. And you've got to think that if a guy can bring a Siskin aircraft out of a death throes kind of spin in formation, he's going to be a pretty damn good pilot when it comes to a dogfight over the skies of Britain.
Yes, well, it had occurred to me. I was thinking that they're facing an enemy that is pretty experienced. Some of those Luftwaffe pilots have fought in Spain. Many will have been in Poland. Most of them will have been in the Battle of France. And suddenly you're facing pilots who might be new directly to the fighter pilot job. So they have to be pretty good pilots, even if they're not got combat experience. How did the Canadians fare against the Luftwaffe in those Battle of Britain, those summer months of 1940?
They started off not very well, because on their actual first day of operations, they accidentally, mistaking it for a German bomber, because the profile of a German bomber looked like the Blenheim, they shoot down a Blenheim and attack other Blenheims by accident, and a number of RAF crew are lost in this, but they very quickly recover. In terms of the reputation, there's an apology delivered, and quite profusely recognizing that these guys are so tense and so eager and yet inexperienced at that point in dealing with the squadrons of German bombers. Ultimately, though, they perform very well, both within 242 at the hands of Douglas Bader, his leadership, and within RCAF number 1, and across the board. Many of the squadrons that the Canadians served in were among the highest scoring. 242 wasn't the highest scoring, and incidentally, the highest scoring was 303 Squadron, which was Polish pilots, and their flying commander, one of their flying commanders, is a Canadian.
Yeah, that's Johnny Kent.
Correct. And we can talk about him for a couple minutes if you want.
Yeah, absolutely. Because how does a Canadian find himself flying with the Poles?
Well, not too divergent from the path that I've described to you previously. He was one of the 118 Canadians who gets on a cattle boat, gets into the direct entry scheme. Johnny Kent gets to Britain quite early in the mid-30s, actually. And while he wants to fight, they keep stringing him off because of his capability and his obvious skill into a whole variety of other activities, other operations. He gets sent to Farnborough, and that's the location of the test piloting. And he's told that he is to test the capability and the strength and the efficiency of tethered barrage balloons. Now, we all know from pictures that the balloons were tethered, I don't know, a couple hundred feet off the ground, essentially to prevent low-level attacks by enemy aircraft. Well, how do you test the efficacy of a barrage balloon that's tethered unless you crash into it? So Johnny Kent, in the late 30s, undertakes to do no fewer than 300 controlled collisions with barrage balloons and lives to tell the tale. He does so successfully that he earns an Air Force Cross. And in 1939, on the eve of the outbreak of the war, actually it's in February, he gets called to Buckingham Palace, and King George VI plants on his chest an Air Force Cross acknowledging his service as a test pilot. All Kent wants to do is to fight. So then they send him off to a reconnaissance squadron. And they give him, finally, he gets his hands on a Spitfire. But the Spitfire he's flying doesn't have a radio, doesn't have guns, doesn't have armor plating around the cockpit. Why? To make it lighter. They want to give the Spitfire capability in the reconnaissance squadron of going at great altitude and taking photography over Germany and occupied Europe, right? So Kent is up there, again, wishing to hell he could fight. And he doesn't have any guns. He's got a camera. And so the first operations as the war begins he's involved in are taking pictures. And he's taking, in one flight, he takes 250 photographs. And he photographs, among other things, the large troop movements of the Germans toward the Polish border in late 1939. Again, all he wants to do is to fight. When he's obviously proven himself, crashing into barrage balloons and taking aerial photography at 28,000 feet, they finally assign him to a combat squadron, and they tell him he's going to now help train other aircrew, other pilots, and they send him to number 303, the all-Polish squadron, none of the pilots of whom can speak a word of English.
My assumption is the Poles were also pretty good pilots because they probably came fully trained.
And you alluded to it earlier when the Germans had faced the Poles over Poland. And these guys had, lost in the air ultimately against the Luftwaffe, but those who'd survived had fled to England. And just like the RAF threw the Canadians into 242 Squadron, clumping them all together, the RAF throw the Poles into 303 Squadron, clumping them all together. And Johnny takes on the job of helping to train these guys. Now, why would you think a guy who has no combat training would be training young men who do have combat experience over Poland? And that's because the Poles hadn't had much experience flying British aircraft. And when I did a little digging, I found out that in Europe, some of this is obvious. In Europe, they're flying with kiloliters or liters of fuel and kilometers of distance. In Britain, of course, it's miles and gallons. Well, you better know how many gallons of fuel you got in your Hurricane if you're going to get home. In a European, and in particular a Polish fighter aircraft, when you took off or accelerated, you pushed the throttles in the cockpit towards your body. You pulled it towards you. In a Spitfire or Hurricane, you pushed the throttles away. So that's ass backwards for the Poles. They had to learn how to deal with that. But the most difficult thing the Poles had to deal with in Hurricanes and Spitfires was retractable undercarriages. The Poles kept landing the Spits and the Hurries without deploying the landing gear. Now, that's not to say that the Poles were stupid, not at all. As I said a moment ago, they had more experience in the air fighting the Luftwaffe than Johnny Kent did. But he had to train these young guys how to fly British aircraft and be competent and capable as well as they had been in Polish aircraft, in British aircraft. And of course, there's that famous scene in the Battle of Britain movie, which was produced by a Canadian, by the way. When they shot it in 1968 and they scripted it, they decided to make the scene training the Poles with an RAF British officer, not with a Canadian officer. And of course, it becomes the butt of a joke, the fact that the Poles don't speak any English and they get raked over the coals for leaping out of a training exercise to attack German bombers. Well, it didn't happen that way. Johnny Kent was up in the skies over Britain with a squadron of Polish aircrew from 303, and he's training them in formation flying and mock dogfights. And suddenly they see ahead and below them a squadron of German bombers going toward a target in Britain, and they call ahead to the squadron leader, a guy named Kellett, the Poles do, and ask for permission to leave the exercise. And Kent watches them go, and they go down and shoot down 2 bombers or something. Now, in the movie, they get raked over the coals for having left the formation without permission. That's not how it was. And in the final part of that scene, the actor portraying the British officer leading the Poles rips a strip off them for doing what they did, and then says, oh, at the end, by the way, Keith Park has now given you permission to become operational. That's not how it happened. Johnny Kent, witnessing the skill of the Poles, tells Keith Park that now the Polish squadron is operationally capable and the Poles get the permission now to become a fighting squadron. And they, in 42 days of the 113-day Battle of Britain, become the highest scoring fighter squadron in the entire Battle of Britain. They shot down 126 German aircraft.
How are they communicating? Because I presume Johnny Kent can't speak Polish and they won't have much English.
To start, Johnny takes them around on the ground, around the Hurricane, and says aeroplane, and the Poles say samolot. And Johnny writes down of the phonetics of that and puts it on a pad and then puts it to his thigh on a pad in the cockpit so he can use this phonetic language to work with the Poles. But eventually the Poles are skilled enough to communicate in not just their own language and the phonetic language that Johnny invents, but in English. And they become, as I say, the highest scoring squadron in fighter command during the Battle of Britain.
So when the Canadians arrive, like the Royal Canadian Air Force, and how close is their battle tactics and doctrine to what the RAF are doing? Or are they doing something different? Had they developed their own way of doing things? I mean, I guess this will all loop into what I was going to ask about Barda's Big Wing and how this all fits together with how people were thinking. I don't know if the Canadians inject something new into the thinking of how war was fought.
Great question, because in fact they did. Now, when they all get there, the members of RCAF number 1 Fighter Squadron arriving in June, just 3 weeks before the Battle of Britain, they're green. And they make the mistake in the earliest days of the battle, shooting down the Blenheim. And they essentially are trained by the book. They're trained to do, really tight formations in combat. Well, even the RAF brass recognized very quickly that the German fighter aircraft tactics are vastly different. They're not flying in tight formation when they're in dogfights or attacking. They're spread out, and they use the four-finger formation style, spread out at different altitudes looking for each other's backs. Well, very quickly, the Canadians and other members of the RAF fighter command learn those same tactics, but they also adapt to the way the battle evolved. There's a great scene involving RCAF number 1 Fighter Squadron in which the Germans in their bomber formations revert to what's called a circular defensive tactic, where as they move toward the target, they're actually flying the bombers in a circle to essentially nose to tail, nose to tail, nose to tail to provide each other protection. And Gordon McGregor, who is Ernie McNab's wingmate in the squadron, recognizes they got to do something different to attack the bombers than the traditional formation style or even the four-finger style. And so Gordon says, follow my lead. And he leads the squadron right down through the middle of the donut of the circle and attacks them from the inside where they're most vulnerable. And they shoot down a number of aircraft and defy and defeat the German maneuver to protect themselves by coming up with the Canadian maneuver, which ultimately is adapted to and adopted by everybody. So that's a small indication of how malleable and how quick response among the Canadians made the difference. They weren't unique in that, but it certainly proved their skill in recognizing that they couldn't stand still in this battle. They had to evolve and adapt and change their tactics even daily.
But Barda's squadron would be central to his arguments over the big wing argument, which I mean, you might want to explain the bit about Barda's big wing thinking. I didn't know if they had any preference to the whole argument, which runs for a long time on this tactic of the big wing.
Well, the big wing comes out of Barda's ego, largely. But it also comes out of his experience in recognizing that a fighter squadron in the Battle of Britain is 12 operational fighters. And this reverts back to Hugh Dowding's tactics, realizing he's facing what essentially is odds of 3-1 in favor of the Germans. He could not allow fighter command pilots to chase after the fighters, the German fighters, because it would become a battle of attrition. And, they get one, we get one, they get one, we get one. And if that were the case, the RAF would have been out of it in a month. So Dowding uses as a tactic to protect those group sectors in southern England a kind of a veneer effect. Not very deep, not very many aircraft, but wide, essentially spreading his squadrons across that front in southern England, giving everybody some protection. Dowding's axiom was, some bombers will always get through, but if we can redirect them, we can get in their way, we can knock a few of them down consistently, the impact will be reduced. But that meant that Dowding's squadrons, 12 aircraft at best, could be up against 100, 200, or 300 bombers at once. Barda said, no. What we need are 3, 4, 5 squadrons together. So I got 60, 70, 80 aircraft so that we can deliver a bigger punch. We can actually wipe a German squadron of bombers from the skies, which would do wonders for his ego, And that ultimately is his big wing concept. Lee Mallory gives him the opportunity on a number of occasions to experiment with the big wing, and it pays off. But Dowding's fear, and there were others within Fighter Command who opposed the big wing concept, including, by the way, Johnny Kent. He recognized that some of the very small problems in communications in the air meant that the RTs, the radios in Spitfires, couldn't always communicate with the radios in Hurricanes. And if a big wing involving both Spitfires and Hurricanes were flying together and needed to communicate with each other, they had to go to ground and back up again to ultimately get that communication straightened out. Kent remembers a moment when a large number of fighters, Spitfires, are heading in one direction, and he wants to radio them because they're part of a larger, almost big wing group to attack what he sees as a bomber squadron ahead of him below, and the Spitfires miss it. They completely go in, and he can't communicate with them. So the problem with the big wing was if you took a larger number of aircraft and sent them all off in one direction and you missed where the large formation of German bombers was coming from or attacking, you could be reducing the defense of Britain drastically by missing the engagement. Dowding insisted that if we had some delivery of defense across that wide veneer of protection, that would be better. And the argument persisted all the way through the Battle of Britain. And on some days, Botter was right. He delivered a great punch, and the Canadians basked in the glory of great numbers shooting down bombers. On other days, they were sent to the wrong places, and the damage on the ground to aviation factories in the south, to air bases which were strafed and bombed by the Luftwaffe unscathed or unopposed, and later during the Blitz, bombing parts of London when the big wing went somewhere else, were tragic days. So it was a little of this and a little of that, but ultimately they won the day by essentially abiding mostly by Dowding's tactics of spreading that veneer of protection across all of southern England.
I sort of almost feel that Barder partly champions it because it gives him more, it makes him more important. I guess to command more stuff because he's not necessarily on the most southerly defensive area of Barder. So it allows him to draw himself into the battle, which is exactly where he wants to be.
He wants to be in the center of the action, and he was. He was in 11 Group, I think it was, north of the hottest fighting in 10 Group around London. And so he was always chomping at the bit to get into it. They would leave Coltishall and fly to Duxford, which was closer to the borderline between the two groups. And they were just waiting. And Botter was just like, a caged tiger wanting to get into the battle and to take large numbers of fighters with him in his big wing to prove his point. And Lee Mallory restrains them and recognizes that they're not to go into the battle until called upon. Now, all of this was the politics of the battle, and other authors have dealt with that in greater depth and with greater effect than my observation of it. But essentially, the Canadians were dragged along for either the party or the deficiency.
Is there a Canadian command structure, or are they just fighting as RAF units, even when the Canadian squadron's there?
Well, the only self-sufficient Canadian squadron in the Battle of Britain is RCF number 1 Fighter Squadron, the one that Ernie McNab is leading, and it essentially is like about 20 pilots. But it also had with it, when they came over in June of 1940, nearly 150 ground crew. And that was another vital aspect of the battle, which is often overlooked. The fact that the riggers and the fitters and the instrument technicians and all those people who patched together the Hurricanes overnight and the Spitfires overnight so that the squadrons could be airborne effectively the next morning hardly get any notice. And yet I found 3 wonderful stories of ground crew who essentially bring that skill, the capability on the ground to the fore, and essentially make the difference, keeping more of the squadrons airborne in the battle through those 113 days. It's a great, great story. There's a wonderful rigger, guy named John Burtis. He was known as Slim because he was tall and beanpole kind of a guy. And he ends up at RCF number 1. He's at Northolt. He was not only a leader in terms of the ground crew and the skills and their ability to patch up the aircraft and rearm them and reoxygenate them and all the rest of the stuff that had to be done overnight. He also recognized that his men had to be led. They were all young and had to learn. And so he made sure that their spirits were up. And one of the things he loved to do was to sing. So when they weren't working, they were singing. And he loved Cab Calloway's Minnie the Moocher. So he was always singing Minnie the Moocher. So you have this absolutely absurd scene. It's dark of night. It's in the Blitz. Their hangars are blacked out. They're inside. They're all working overnight with flashlights, repairing the Hurricanes to get them ready for flight the next morning, like literally in the dawn hours. And they're with flashlights in the dark singing Minnie the Moocher. This is the way the Canadian ground crew kept their act together and delivered those Hurricanes the next morning for the sorties of the day. It's a great story and another element of the very much Canadian aspect of this battle.
Yeah. What was the attrition rate like for the Canadians during the Battle of Britain?
We had 105 to 110 pilots, 20 of whom were killed during the battle. Ground crew numbered nearly 150 and were spread out across not just RCAF bases, but RAF bases, and, brought that skill as all the ground crews did. But the bottom line was that we lost 20 pilots in the battle, but we were the second largest contingent in the battle as well. A lot of people think the Poles and the Czechs and the New Zealanders were. The Canadians had nearly 300 air and ground crew in the battle, and the British had 2,500. So we were the second largest number in the Battle of Britain.
So what happens to the pilots post-Battle of the Britain? Are many posted back to Canada to take back in the air training scheme, or do they carry on in the RAF? Is it diminishing returns for these lads who've actually probably been fairly worn out by the Battle of Britain?
Well, you've hit on a really important point. The climax, of course, is Battle of Britain Sunday, September the 15th, when both sides threw everything at each other. But after that, Hitler, whose plan that in his original Sea Lion plan was to invade Britain on September the 15th, postpones the plan because Hermann Goering has not delivered on his promise to eliminate the RAF in 4 weeks. But in October, as the final days of the Battle of Britain are evolving, remarkably, the Canadians at RCF No. 1 Fighter Squadron and across the other RAF squadrons are suffering perhaps greatest in the fatigue that's setting in. Remember, these guys have been fighting for 50-some days straight, maybe 2, sometimes 3 sorties a day. Imagine the strain, imagine the tension, and imagine the loss as they see comrades lost. But the hidden factor in all this, Angus, is that, and the Canadians tried to hide this, was that the Canadian fighter squadrons, or the fighter pilots, were among the eldest of the fighter pilots in the Battle of Britain. Ideally, and the RAF was pretty tough on the inbound or influx of fighter pilots, ideally you had to be 19, 20, 21 years old to be in your prime in a Hurricane or a Spitfire. Ernie McNab turned 34 during the Battle of Britain. His wingmate, Gordon McGregor, turned 39 in 1940. These guys were the old men. In fact, Hartland Molson, who was RCF No. 1 Fighter Squadron, he said the Canadians were the old man business club in the Battle of Britain because they were the eldest. And probably, I'm not a doctor here, but clearly the diary records show that the guys who were flagging in October, they were showing the fatigue quickest and more readily, were the Canadians. It's a wonderful moment in the memoirs of Ernie McNab, the squadron leader, RCF No. 1 Fighter Squadron. He was so tired that if after 2 sorties in a day, he was needed to be back in the air a third time, he told his Batman, when he was down on the ground ultimately and waiting for the next scramble, to put a cup of hot tea in his lap so that if he keeled over to fall asleep, the tea would wake him up and he would be back alert and ready to go on the scramble. I mean, they were that tired. And when they are finally given a break at the end of October, the medical officer recognizes that these guys are suffering the greatest, and they send them off to Scotland immediately at the end of October to recover, to get through this fatigue factor. And then many stay on and become the leading edge of the squadrons that eventually lead in the lead up to D-Day and beyond. Some do go back to Canada and take on, as you suggested, instructing roles and commanding roles in the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, and others end up in East Grimstead with the burns and wounds and psychological wounds that many did as a result of the horrific fires in their crashed Hurricanes and Spitfires. And they are treated there and returned to Canada not only with the physical wounds of their burns, but also the psychological ones.
That's the guinea pig club, isn't it?
Correct. And interestingly, again, Canadian participation there. When they're working on the grafting and the the treatment of the burns. It's a Canadian surgeon, a guy named Ross Tilley, who comes to East Grinstead, and he suggests through his own experience the use of saline baths to keep the skin and flesh supple and repairable. His idea of using the salt baths is adopted by the doctors at Grimstead and essentially helps the men who are being treated and the guinea pigs getting the grafting of skin and noses and ears and even limbs, fingers and so on back in place. It's the saline bath which is key to that process, and it was created by a Canadian.
There we go. I don't think I have anything else. We've sort of skipped through quite a lot there.
Well, thank you. I mean, to me, I sound like I'm waving the Canadian flag here. It's what I've done through the last group of books that I've done on Second World War subjects, from The Great Escape to The Dam Busters to this Battle of Britain. But all I'm saying really is, and you and I talked about this a little bit off the air, that when men went into the RAF, from whatever part of the Commonwealth they came, they all looked the same. They had the same serge blue uniforms, the same wings, the same ribbons, the same perfectly cocked cap on their heads. But what the Canadians brought to the Battle of Britain was something that is in their character, personality, and their skill, which we've alluded to in our conversation, that didn't change the direction of the battle, didn't ultimately win it, but contributed to the tide shifting from what could have been a potential loss, could have been the last domino falling in northwestern Europe to Hitler, but wasn't, that didn't. These young men brought to the battle their capabilities as barnstormers and crop dusters and bush pilots, and suddenly that skill and ability was in critical demand and vital to their survival and the winning of the victory.
Absolutely. Well, that seems like a good place to leave it. Thanks. Loyal listener, if you want to know more, Ted's book is The Battle of Britain, Canadian Airmen in Their Finest Hour. Well, that's all for this episode. Don't forget, if you regularly enjoy the show, why not sign up to be a patron at patreon.com/WW2podcast. So until next time, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.